writing, it seems to me, is an art form that yields to time. If one dedicates enormous hours to it, you see yourself writing faster, writing more naturally, writing more elegantly, a style coming out. You develop and you start to detect in yourself the ability to explain ideas more easily, to use humor, to bring the inflection maybe of your own spoken voice onto the page. I assume that similar things play out in other fields, whether it be martial arts or ballet or playing a musical instrument. I just don't know because I don't have direct experience with those things. But I definitely have found that writing, it yields to hours and hours of effort, but that those hours of effort are irreplaceable. I mean, there's simply nothing else that will do. But just bear in mind that your quality as a writer and the posterity of what you write, and posterity is the most lasting measurement of any piece of writing or art, so far as I'm concerned, that is only going to yield to hours and to time and to sweat equity.
Hey everyone, welcome to Artist Decoded. I'm your host Yoshino, and this is my conversation with my friend, author and historian Mitch Horowitz, who is one of the leading voices in the subjects of mysticism, the occult, and the esoteric. He's written more than a dozen books, which have been translated to Arabic, Korean, Italian, Chinese, Spanish, and Portuguese as well. Let me tell you, but Mitch has made a very profound impact on my personal life. I remember our mutual friend, Jesse Draxler, talking to me about bringing him onto the podcast back in May. They had a fascinating conversation that covered a lot of ground in the subjects of mind metaphysics, the occult, and hypnagogia. And after their conversation, I looked more into Mitch's work and found his audiobook called Awakened Mind, which is about an hour and a half. It's jam-packed with tons of information that's very useful. But one section in particular in this book talked about the power of the mastermind, which I later found out is a subject that Mitch wrote about in a book entitled The Power of the Mastermind. But I talked to Mitch a few days after that podcast episode was put out, and Mitch suggested that we start our own mastermind. Let me tell you from my personal experience that starting this group has been exceptionally transformative in my life. I would highly suggest that everyone start their own mastermind group. We talk a bit about the origins and philosophies of this idea in this podcast episode, but the main reason why I wanted to bring Mitch onto the podcast was to talk about his writing practice and his habits. Which, speaking about habits, Mitch has a book coming out in January called Cosmic Habit Force. So be sure to check that out when it's out. You can go to mitchhorowitz.com or you can find him on Twitter and Instagram. We're going to be doing a follow-up podcast in a few months talking about the book as well, so be sure to check back. And before we begin this episode, please go to our iTunes page. It only takes a minute or two. Leave us that 5-star review. And leave a written review if you would like as well. It helps for people just like yourself to hear about this very podcast, and the more the merrier. So here it is, my conversation with author and historian and friend, Mitch Horowitz. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for joining us, man.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate you for doing this. So for those, I think it was interesting because we had you on the podcast and Jesse Draxler interviewed you, which was a really great episode. And then after that, so I listened to the episode and I think you were talking about masterminds in that episode. Was that correct?
Yeah, among other things, yeah.
Yeah, among many other things. And then I contacted you about just getting information about a mastermind, and then you suggested that we start a mastermind together, and I thought that was it's been really awesome, and it's been very impactful and cathartic for me at least.
Oh, I appreciate hearing that. That's great. It's been the same for me. A mastermind is a step out of Napoleon Hill's writing, and basically any any number of people, starting with two, a group of two or more people get together at regular intervals, usually once a week, and they discuss their goals, their desires, their needs, and the mastermind serves as kind of a mutual support group. And typically, members of the mastermind group will hold one another's wishes, needs, desires in mind. They might offer advice. They might offer other steps. They might offer, prayers and meditations, depending upon the makeup of the group. And our mastermind group that you're referring to has 4 people in it. And it's a really great step because we live in a very kind of go it alone society, especially with social media. And it's the kind of step that people resist. We don't like to we're not joiners. We're not a nation of joiners anymore. And people don't like to think about steps that, entail other people. But the mastermind group is really a mutual support group. And, Hill said it's the one thing you're going to be most tempted to neglect, but you really have to follow through on it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And actually, now that I think about it, I think where I heard about the idea of the mastermind was in you have this short audiobook called Awaken Mind, I believe, or you did that for some sort of organization. Is that correct?
Oh, well, Awaken Mind began as a short course that I was doing for an organization, and then it morphed into a short book, an audio book. And it's really kind of special to me because even though it's a very short book, believe it or not, it got translated into Arabic in Saudi Arabia, and it might be the first New Thought book ever. New Thought is the philosophy that thoughts are causative. It goes back to the late 19th century. New Thought is kind of an umbrella term for that outlook. It may be the first book of New Thought that's ever been translated into Arabic, or one of the first, certainly. So it's kind of moving to me. I was really surprised that it was being published in Saudi Arabia. I think there's a bookseller there who's just kind of testing the water. So in that vein, it's a really important book to me.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So some of the people that are in that sort of like transcendental New Thought movement, is that correct? Are those two the same?
Not exactly the same. I mean, New Thought grew in the atmosphere of transcendentalism in New England in the mid to late 19th century, mostly taking shape later in the 19th century. So, the two worlds, they were separate, but they had maybe a common core of concerns. And the New Thought people created what I suppose you could call applied transcendentalism. I mean, they wanted to take the insights of transcendentalism, the idea that the mind is kind of the womb of all events, and find ways to apply that to life in a very literal way. So that became New Thought.
Mm. And then some of the leaders in that New Thought movement were Neville Goddard and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Is that correct?
Well, Emerson was more of a progenitor. I think Emerson's essays probably provided like a really early inspiration to some people in that movement. Although, interestingly enough, Emerson and transcendentalism don't start to show up by name in New Thought literature until well into the 19th century, like maybe 1880s or so. So that influence is really important, and it's definitely there, but I think it was more atmospheric than it was direct. But Neville, who was a 20th century figure, for me, he is the most intellectually vibrant and exciting figure to come out of New Thought. He died in 1972, and his teaching was basically that your imagination is what people refer to in scripture as God. Your imagination is the creative force of all that is, and that whatever you experience, including this conversation right now, among those who are listening, it's born of you. It's the projection of your own emotionalized thoughts and mental images. So for people who are listening right now, one could say that there's no Yoshino here. There's no Mitch here. There's just you. And we are just figments of your projected imagination, just because you were prepared to hear these ideas at this particular time. So if you follow Neville's philosophy, that's its logical conclusion. Everything that you experience consists of your own thoughts pushed out into the world.
So what is it specifically about? I mean, because you circle around a lot of the workings of Napoleon Hill and Neville Goddard. What is it about their teachings in particular that really attract you?
I think what attracts me to their teachings is that they're not only very direct and practical, but they deal very squarely with the needs of outer life, with material life. And one of the themes I've been developing for several years in my writing is that in our alternative and some of our traditional spiritual traditions in the world today, and going back through history, I think we've created this artificial division between inner and outer, higher and lower, personality and essence, this notion that there's the temporal and the eternal. I mean, of course, we need generalizations like that to communicate about things, but where would one end and the other begin? I think this notion that humanity has eternal needs and temporal needs draws a line of demarcation in this very subjective way, draws it with a suggestion of clarity, whereas in fact, I think those two things are one whole. I think they totally intermingle. And I think a lot of spiritual seekers get torn in two in a certain sense because they need to attain things in outer life, whether that's creatively, materially, intimately, artistically, financially, whatever it is, health-wise. All these things are vital, critical components of life and are going to determine the individual's quality of experience. But then on the path, whatever tradition they may be attached to, whether it's a melange of beliefs that might be considered New Age or fall into the rubric of alternative spirituality, or whether they're pursuing, Buddhism or one of the Abrahamic faiths or whatever it may be, they might hear messaging that says, the real world is the unseen world. The real world is the one that's below the waves of the surface. And the point is to cultivate non-attachment, non-identification. Attachment causes suffering. And those messages combined with the actual palpably felt needs of daily life, which I celebrate and which I think are as altogether real as needs that are considered more eternal, they pull at them, the wish for attainment. Mm-hmm. However one defines that, and that can be defined very broadly, but whatever it is, the needs of daily existence pull at them, while on the other hand, there's a religious imperative that they're imbibing that says non-identification, non-attachment is the aim, is the direction, is the compass point of truth. And they can really feel torn in two. And my contention is that that's a false division. So I've always had a real instinct for New Thought. I've always liked New Thought because it has its own foibles and failures and problems. I mean, it's never developed a persuasive theology of suffering, for example, and there's a lot of other problems. But I think it's always contained also extraordinary insights and truths in a very popularized form. And I like that. I think a message should be simple. It should be testable, provable in the experience of the individual, or it has no claim or hold on the individual. And I like to be very literal about things because I think our needs are very literal. And I think we sometimes get encouraged to bury those needs under different questions and imperatives that challenge the notion that you as a sensitive individual, you as a mature individual are capable of arriving at what you really need without having that taken away from you in some sense, even if the taking is in the name of something higher, and there again, we get into these problems of language and divisions. I'm not sure that concepts like higher and lower are helpful to the 21st century seeker. I think it's all one whole. So I've always been attracted to New Thought because I think it very unabashedly and in a very unembarrassed way addresses the needs of daily life, which I think are as sacred as any other kind of authentic human need.
So take me back a little bit. So where was the initial interest in, where's the initial interest in writing in particular? Were you always a writer, even when you were a kid and a teenager? Or did you get into it specifically because of the New Thought movement, your interest in that? And how did that interest turn you into wanting to become a historian and doing more research into the occult?
Well, I would say that my emergence as a writer didn't really occur until I was in middle age. I didn't publish my first book, Occult America, until I was well past the age of 40, actually. I think I must have been 43 at the time, going on 44 when the book actually came out.
But you were a
And
journalist before then, is that correct?
only temporarily. I was a journalist briefly after getting out of college, but I was unhappy with daily journalism, and I went into publishing for many years, which was kind of a fitful bargain because in publishing, I was an editor and I had my successes, but I wasn't writing, and I felt very uncomfortable with settling into that role with permanency. And I really credit New Thought, actually. I really credit New Thought and its teaching about the agencies and powers of the mind with being an invaluable stepping stone to redirecting my career and my life into writing, which has been hugely fulfilling because I really was not functioning as a writer for most of my, I would say, latter 20s throughout my much of my 30s. I rediscovered writing as I was going into my late 30s. And when I did, then things like really started to happen because it ignited a passion within me that I hadn't felt previously in terms of the work that I was doing. And when I was a little kid, I dreamt of being a writer. I didn't come from a background that particularly primed me up for that. I came from kind of a working middle class background in Eastern Queens. Education was considered something that you used for vocational purposes, and that was that. And I also felt at a very young age that my parents would be unable to support me financially, into young adulthood. And I started to think very seriously about needing to structure my life in such a way that I'd have financial stability. So I tended at a young age to move away from artistic pursuits, feeling that I needed a more hard-headed direction in life. And publishing, book publishing, working in publishing was an uneasy compromise that I struck so that I had a corporate job with health benefits and the reliability that a corporate job brings, but I was still working within the cultural sphere. And frankly, it was an unhappy bargain. I accomplished a lot of things. I did a lot of good things, but ultimately for me personally, it was an unhappy bargain. And when I started to rediscover writing, I began writing articles for small metaphysical magazines when I was in maybe starting around age 36, 37. Suddenly things started to take off in this dramatic way, and my progress started to pick up momentum, and I worked so hard. I mean, the hours I would put in, and I still do, put in. I mean, as we were saying just before we flicked down the record button, I was up like super early this morning, writing a chapter in a new book that I'm working on, which is called Daydream Believer. And, I really see the arc of my career, the arc of my life as a writer, as being evidence in my experience for the efficacy of New Thought, because that was not something in my 30s that I thought I was going to accomplish. That was a dream that I thought was in my rearview mirror. And I can vividly remember having wishes and memories. It's funny, I said memories, which maybe begs a question about the nature of time. I remember having wishes and fantasies when I was 4 years old, very, very young, that young age where you begin to have long-term memory cognition for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I had this dream and fantasy of being a writer, being in front of the microphone, being in front of the camera. And, it was something that always left a gap and a hole in me. But I was very fortunate that as I approached middle age, that came back to me in a dramatic way and flowered in a dramatic way. So it's probably part of why I work so hard. None of this stuff came to me when I was younger. None of this stuff came to me in some sort of seemingly natural or easy or expectant way. So coming into all this stuff at an older age makes me value it all the more. So I feel it's a privilege to be doing what I'm doing. And that's part of what fuels the hours of work that I put in.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So I guess, I'm curious about, because we've talked on multiple occasions and I've told you about my interest in becoming a writer. And, I've been writing the past couple of years, but I'm starting to make it more of a habit. And I'm just curious what those initial habits that you started to form in the beginning when you were starting to write your first book, Occult America, how those habits were during that time, and then how those habits of writing have changed over the years. And did those habits inform you into creating the book, The Miracle Habits?
Definitely. Writing, it seems to me, is an art form that yields to time. If one dedicates enormous hours to it, you see yourself writing faster, writing more naturally, writing more elegantly, a style coming out. You develop and you start to detect in yourself the ability to explain ideas more easily, to use humor, to bring the inflection maybe of your own spoken voice onto the page. I assume that similar things play out in other fields, whether it be martial arts or ballet or playing a musical instrument. I just don't know because I don't have direct experience with those things. But I definitely have found that writing, it yields to hours and hours of effort, but that those hours of effort are irreplaceable. I mean, there's simply nothing else that will do but sitting down and drilling and practicing your craft again and again. And when I rediscovered myself as a writer, it was in the summer of 2003. I must have been around age 36 or so. And there was a small metaphysical magazine called Science of Mind that assigned me an interview with the MLB pitcher Barry Zito, who at the time was pitching for the Oakland A's, and he later went on to pitch for the San Francisco Giants. And he was a very popular figure in baseball at the time, not only because he was a very winning pitcher, but because he was widely known to use metaphysical methods, particularly mind power and new thought methods, as part of his training regimen. And so some people considered him very weird. Other people considered him very inspiring. For me, of course, it was the latter. And this little magazine landed an interview with Barry, and it was a very big get. And they saw me as someone they could trust to handle it for them. And they approached me. And I remember in prepping for the interview, which turned into a feature article that I wrote about Barry called Barry's Way, which I've posted recently on Medium, so it's available. I did a writing exercise that I recommend to everybody, that was recommended to me by a MacArthur-winning political essayist, and I found it to be enormously useful. I took a piece of writing that I admired, in this case, another profile of Barry that appeared in the New York Times maybe a few months earlier than the piece that I was working on. And just to see how it worked, just to get to the inner guts of what the journalist was doing, I rewrote his article by hand. And I did this as a strictly private internal exercise. But the critical thing was not doing it on a computer screen, but really sitting down in a tactile way, in a physical tactile way, with pen or pencil in hand and writing down the article word for word by hand, which gives you a sense of what a writer is doing, what decisions he or she is making, where the connective tissue is, what's really going on in the inner guts of the work. And I recommend that exercise to everybody. I think I also have an article about that exercise on Medium. It's called something like How to Take a Great Leap Forward in Your Writing, or something of that nature. But the basic exercise is really simple. Whether you're interested in writing fiction, whether you're interested in writing nonfiction, take a piece of writing that you admire by somebody who you'd like to emulate. So it could be a chapter from a novel, it could be a short story, it could be an article or essay by a nonfiction writer or journalist. And again, sit down and rewrite it by hand, not on a device, but by hand on paper. And there's something about that physical motor coordinated act. There's something about the tactile act of actually sitting down and rewriting someone's piece that gives you a real experience of what that writer is doing and the choices that he or she is making. And again, the transitions, the connections, you start to see it all in a new way. You start to experience it. And so that was super helpful. And what was also helpful above all else, as I alluded earlier, was just continuing to go, writing article after article after article, piece after piece after piece. And I published, I think in February of 2005, a historical profile of Neville Goddard, who we were talking about earlier, the New Thought teacher and mystic. Mm-hmm. And that that came out also in Science of Mind magazine. I think that was called the Essence of Things Hoped For, Searching for Neville Goddard, because at that time, Neville, who's widely known today, was not a well-known figure and was even kind of a mysterious figure. You know, people didn't know who he was. Where did he come from? Neville was originally from the island of Barbados and relocated to the United States. And he was just not a widely known, widely photographed, widely heard from figure. There was kind of a mysterious quality about him. So that article was very special to me because I grokked to Neville very early. In fact, it was Barry Zito who recommended Neville's work to me. And I began to ask myself, who is this man? So I wrote this historical profile of Neville, which appeared in February of 2005. And that was a pivotal moment for me because I realized that I could get my arms around these topics as a historian, both from a practical perspective and as a historian. And I always tell people that what you can do on a micro scale, you can repeat on a macro scale. What you can do on the micro scale, you can repeat on the macro scale. So my ability to sit down and write a really coherent and hopefully compelling portrait historically of Neville Goddard told me that I was going to be able to do that on a larger scale as well. And within less than a year of that time, I started working on the proposal for my first book, Occult America. And within a year hence, I had a book contract with Random House to publish Occult America. And I can't even begin to tell you the hours that I put in, but that article was so confirming for me because it told me that I was capable of building this house. You know, I built a house in miniature, and so I knew I could build one on a grander, more epic scale, and that was super important to me. So I encourage writers to, you know, always watch for what you can do on a small scale because that can be repeated on a large one as well.
So would you suggest for someone to go on Medium and be able to publish their own articles?
I think that that's a positive thing to do. Yes. You know, I mean, I like the tech that Medium provides. I think that it's a really neat, incredibly user-friendly tech. There have been some changes at Medium over the past 2 or 3 years that I think have frankly detracted from it as an organ, as an outlet. You know, at first Medium was kind of like YouTube. Anybody could go on Medium and post an article, and there were editors who would curate and distribute these articles. And I was a paid contributor to Medium for a certain period of time. And other times I was not specifically a paid contributor, but my pieces would get what they would call curated. So they'd get spread across different subject pages. And then they switched to a system where the site was divided into publications, hundreds of publications. And each publication has its own editor. And the process served, in my experience at least, to basically replicate exactly what the outer world of writing and journalism is, which is just a series of gatekeepers to whom you have to appeal if you want to get your stuff out there into the world. And a lot of people were coming to Medium, including a lot of extraordinary writers, specifically because they wanted an exit ramp out of that process. And then somewhere along the line, Medium seemed to replicate that process. So I kind of pulled back from my participation. I did just post a piece there quite recently that I'm very proud of, about how concepts of the occult and the satanic became demonized. And that piece is called Familiarity is Not Truth, and ways in which there are certain familiar words and terms that we think we have our arms around, but that are just kind of cultural tropes. And I was happy to put that up there. It was a piece that I wrote in an impromptu fashion, and Medium gave me an opportunity, you know, as a tech platform to, you know, post it in an attractive way. And I think it continues to provide that opportunity regardless of how an individual writer feels about the whole publication system or whether that system, in fact, still holds sway there. I'm frankly not certain. But I do think it's a good exercise because it gives you a chance to use the tech of a platform that I think is very, very user-friendly, gives you something to promote over social media or to your networks, whatever they may be. You know, you have a real and authentic byline, but don't get hypnotized by that. You know, I would say don't let the appeal of that attractive page, that attractive tech, that user-friendly platform, all of which are good things, and the appearance of that byline, also a good thing. Don't let that work a spell over you because
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
it's still it's all sweat equity. It all comes down to sweat equity. And pieces on Medium, there are some pieces that attract lots of clicks. There are some pieces that attract few. There are mysterious reasons behind that. But rather than get distracted with any of the mechanisms, just bear in mind that your quality as a writer and the posterity of what you write, and posterity is the most lasting measurement of any piece of writing or art, so far as I'm concerned, that is only going to yield to hours and to time and to sweat equity.
Yeah, totally. So then do you write maybe shorter form articles, for instance, in order to use that as like a testing ground, somewhat like a stand-up comedian, how stand-up comedians go to maybe smaller venues to be able to practice material, to be able to bring to their, I don't know, television or Netflix special or something like that?
Oh, yes. I do that all the time, actually. I not infrequently, I might be working, for example, on a book, and maybe I'll be producing a chapter in that book that I will put out first as an article, or I might put it on Patreon, or it might go somewhere else. And it's very helpful to me because I'll get a feel for how it looks and reads in a medium other than my Microsoft Word file. I'll get feedback from people.
Yeah.
It's a way of, it's kind of like a batting cage, or a workout mat. It's a way of airing what's on your mind, and you'll get a look at it, from a different perspective. You'll get some feedback. Yeah, I think it's super helpful. I do that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about this because I think there's a lot of overlap. I mean, you were even talking about martial arts, although you aren't a martial artist, but
right.
I mean, yeah, I think it's very similar. Like if we want to compare it to boxing, for instance, like when you first start boxing, the first thing they teach you is how to do a jab, and then you keep on doing the jab and you hit, you learn how to do it in different intervals, and you learn how to, feint, and you double up on the jab, and then you learn different ways and angles and methods. And I think that's very similar to the writing process in a lot of ways, because it's just constant grinding and hard work. And I like the idea of that too, because it seems, things seem more achievable if you have discipline as opposed to just straight out the gate. I think there's this sort of like romantic fantasy that a lot of people, kind of, I think it's partially because of the culture, that we live in. And there's also this kind of like toxic fantasy of the self-made person as well. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that requires a lot of talent or there's a uniqueness to that. But I think there's something more valuable to people, on a general scale, to be able to know that they can put the hard work in to achieve something that they want to achieve.
It is real. Absolutely. And to continue with the martial arts, I don't know if they're metaphors or parallel examples, but there was a mixed martial arts coach who told me that he works with a lot of talented fighters, but he said that the dividing line frequently between those who really get somewhere, who really improve dramatically, and those who don't is cardio. He said, there's a lot of fighters who maybe they're fast, they're strong, they're agile, they have incredible coordination, but if they don't do the cardio, they're going to run out of gas in the ring, and by a certain point, they're just going to be helpless. And he said, I can always tell who's going to break away from the pack. Yes, you have to have talent. You have to have this. You have to have that. You have to have great moves. You have to practice those moves. But if you don't put in the dedicated cardio, you're simply not going to get anywhere. You're going to run out of gas. And I view writing in a similar way. Again, it's putting in those hours, putting in that time. It's not a flourish. It's a constant disciplined practice. And when you engage in that constant discipline practice, then you're capable of the flourish. Another thing I would advise aspiring writers is, since you made the reference of the kind of the myth of the self-made person, be careful that you don't get into the fantasy of like, oh, gee, I want to move to a little log cabin somewhere out in the woods, and that's going to give me
Thoreau.
Yeah, exactly. Or the Unabomber, and which is probably a more common outcome. And
lose your mind.
you lose your mind. The thing is, you have to keep in mind that um, even the best writers, who are super disciplined and just really steady, you only have a few hours a day in you, of this stuff. And maybe you can recharge through meditation or through a workout or through a run or whatever it is. And that there's something to be said for that. But I find that, I will sometimes get up really early in the morning. I might have like a couple of hours of really kick-ass writing in me. And then like I really got to take a break. And I might revive, early in the afternoon, a couple more hours of kick-ass writing. But you don't get a lot more than that. There may be other things you can do. Obviously, there's other tasks, other duties, other things to occupy one's day. But, certain people get themselves into trouble by thinking that if they go to that proverbial cabin in the woods, or sometimes literal cabin in the woods, they're just going to write all day long. And they might find that, you wake up in the morning and after a couple of hours, you're gassed. And that's why people start sometimes to turn to like drugs or booze or other addictions. It can be depressing. It can be difficult. If you live in an urban area or you live in a well-populated area, there's nothing. I mean, there's no greater advantage to like being in a cabin on a lake than there is to being able to just close your door and work. If other circumstances permit that. Obviously, people's lives are very complex, and I'm generalizing, but circumstances permitting, a chair is a chair, and it doesn't matter if that chair is inside of a closet or if that chair, is at the proverbial cabin. And if the chair is inside of a closet, I would estimate you're probably going to be happier because you'll come out into the world and you can go down the block and do something and see people and what have you. I don't think that some sort of isolation is necessary for you to pursue your craft as a writer. So I would just issue a note of caution there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that speaks more about maybe a human desire of escapism, if anything.
Yes.
Or like I don't know, I guess the popular term of, traveling the world is like wanderlusting or something, right?
Yeah, I think we all have that dream to some greater or lesser degree. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely know that I've personally had, just desires for escapism. And I mean, I think that is good to examine too, which can inform the writing and, maybe even give like some subjects to write about. But when you were talking about the Unabomber, I was thinking about, have you ever seen that movie Antichrist?
No, I haven't.
By Lars von Trier. So basically like William Dafoe and I forget who the other actor was. But anyways, it's basically like him and his wife. They go, they go through this extremely traumatic experience, and then, he's a therapist and tries to like essentially be her therapist, and then they decide to go in the cabin in the woods, and then just a lot of crazy shit happens. But most Lars von Trier films are pretty dismal.
Oh, I think I'm going to watch that tonight. I like that recommendation. So yes, folks, stay away from the cabin in the woods.
Yeah.
Stay in your apartment.
Yeah. Exactly. So I'm curious. Also, what is it particular about this word miracle that resonates with you? Because you have 3 books, at least from my knowledge, you have 3 books that all start with miracle: The Miracle Club, The Miracle Habits, and The Miracle of a Definite Chief Aim.
Yeah. Well, it really started with the Miracle Club, and the title of the Miracle Club came from a piece of occult history that's always been very important to me. In 1875, there was a little circle of seekers here in New York City, where I'm speaking from, who formed the Theosophical Society, which became this kind of worldwide organization, which is still with us today for the exploration of esoteric and occult ideas. But prior to the founding, they formed a precursor group, a little circle called the Miracle Club, where they were interested in studying psychical powers and channeling and mediumship and ESP and different topics, ranging from Kabbalah to reincarnation to Hindu or Vedic principles. And this little group, the Miracle Club, for various reasons, it just didn't work out. And it petered out after a few months, but it provided the springboard for them to form the larger Theosophical Society. So I've always romanticized and loved the history behind this group, the Miracle Club. So Uh, that first book that you cited, The Miracle Club, which I published in 2018, was my effort to take up their spirit of experimentation again and to invite the reader into it as well, so as to say, look, this is a kind of ad hoc organization. We're all in the Miracle Club. All you have to do is just desire to experiment and then to seek. And then, as it happened, I had a publisher I trusted and worked with who came to me and said, I want you to write a book called The Miracle Habits and The Miracle Month. And, he was thinking from a marketing perspective, but I didn't feel resistant to that because I felt I had ideas that spoke to the direction that he was putting me in. So I persisted and I wrote those books. And I define a miracle very simply as a fortuitous event that exceeds all natural or circumstantial expectation. That's all. It's very simple. It doesn't have to be some wild supernatural definition, but I've seen these things unfold in my own life. I've seen them unfold in other people's lives where something happens or there's a turn in the road that in a fortuitous manner exceeds all expectation or circumstance. And of course, the opposite can hold true too. Everybody would acknowledge that our habits or our behaviors can contribute to catastrophes. In the same way, our habits and our behaviors can contribute to the extraordinary. So I try to define miracle in a way that's more down to earth.
That's cool. I like that. So I was thinking, let's see. Do you have any books to recommend for not even just writing, but just creativity in general?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. I suppose, the books that have inspired me have probably been books that I've said to myself, I want to do this. This person's voice carries something, conveys something that I feel I have within me. And I want to write this way, or I want to talk this way. Such an experience came to me through the book Resurrection by Neville Goddard. Resurrection was the first of Neville's books that I read. And he just had this ability to state his argument over and over and over again, but each time it seemed fresh and it seemed new and it seemed impactful. So Neville's basic teaching is that your imagination is God, or your imagination is what is called God in Scripture. And your imagination is the creative force behind everything that you experience in the most literal, absolute sense. So it's philosophical idealism taken to its fullest, most extreme iteration. And every time Neville argues for this, even though he spent his career arguing for that one point of view, every time he restated it, it sounded fresh and new and vital and urgent. And so that really turned me on. So Neville's book Resurrection was a huge, huge source of influence on me. There was something in his voice, and I said, I want to sound that way. The essays of Emerson have likewise been sources of inspiration. I'm thinking of specifically Compensation, Spiritual Laws, The Oversoul, Circles, and some of his later essays like Success and Power and Fate. I knew that he was capable of capturing inner experience in ways that so very few writers ever have been. The philosopher Jacob Needleman has been an inspiration on me as well, because he too is one of the very, very few living writers who I think is capable of writing about inner experience in a way that's powerful. Krishnamurti, very unclassifiable spiritual teacher, I would say the same of. Another teacher named Vernon Howard, who died in 1992. He was an inspiration on me because he wrote from within the independent spiritual tradition. He was attached to no dogma or doctrine or group. And he wrote truths about human nature in a very blunt, very direct, unsparing way. And I liked his voice enormously because there was such a literalness to it. And there was such a willingness on the part of Vernon Howard to say, no religious or therapeutic or ethical system should have a hold on you unless it evinces actual positive, real concrete change in your life. I find William James similarly compelling. So none of these people who I've referenced wrote about writing per se, but they all had voices that I wanted to emulate. So they were sources of inspiration to me.
You know, a book that I recently finished, and it's a really short book, but Catching the Big Fish
Oh yeah,
by David
yeah,
Lynch. Yeah.
yeah.
And it was interesting because when I was doing a bit of research for this podcast episode, I realized that you interviewed David Lynch, and I listened to that, and it was specifically on Catching the Big Fish. So I thought that was a really interesting synchronicity.
I published that book, Catching the Big Fish. That was that. I was.
Oh,
in,
you did?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Believe it or not, yeah. That was one of the things I'm most proud of from my publishing career. No, it's not necessarily widely known, but.
Apparently, I didn't do my research very well.
No, not at all. No, I mean, listen, I don't think my name, appears anywhere in it. It's not necessarily widely known, but when I was in publishing, that's one of the projects of which I'm most personally proud, and so I was able to interview him on several occasions. Sometimes in connection with that book, sometimes in connection with transcendental meditation or life and creativity more generally. But yeah, I was really privileged to work on that book.
Yeah. Well, if you ever want to interview David Lynch again, feel free to do it for the podcast.
I'll keep it in mind. I think he would like your title, Artist Decoded. I think that's cool.
Yeah. Planting a little seed for you. So, with all of your research into just history and also just in the cult, but where do you think creativity comes from?
That's a really interesting question. There was a psychical researcher in the late 19th century, Frederick Myers, who was one of the first scientists who really created protocols for studying the extraphysical or the paranormal. And he also was one of the key figures in modern life who formulated the idea of the subconscious mind, or what he called the subliminal mind. And he also believed that there was a sort of a supraliminal mind. And he believed that there was a kind of more non-local common mind in which we all partake. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. The ancient Greeks called it nous. But the idea that there's this non-local kind of quality of intellect through which ideas traverse and of which we are all inlets to some extent. And he believed that the genius or creativity has something to do with the existence of this supraliminal mind, this nous, or this kind of overmind. And that was something that he wrote about in his book on the survival of human personality beyond death. That was a classic work that was published posthumously in 1893, a year after his death. That was sort of a treatise that collected his lifelong work on the question of non-local intelligence, the survival of bodily death. And so I think about that, from time to time. And it seems to me that if there's truth there, the qualities of that supraliminal mind, if there is such a thing, will only come through the individual who's finely tuned and finely trained. It won't matter if you're a violin and the strings are broken, or if you're, a violin and the strings haven't been fastened or tightened or tuned, nothing that comes through is going to be very compelling or useful or beautiful. So it seems to me that whether that idea of a supraliminal mind is metaphor or fact, and it may very well be fact, because psychical research demonstrates to us that there is this anomalous transfer of information among minds. There is this extra local, extra physical quality to intelligence, which is another topic entirely. I write and speak frequently on academic psychical research, which I'm really interested in. So, whether one regards this notion metaphorically, whether one regards it literally, it's not going to be operative unless the instrument is ready. And the artist is the instrument, obviously, and he or she has to be ready and prepared so that these things can be received. So wherever it comes from, it'll only come through that instrument, which is finely wrought.
Wow, it's really fascinating. Well, I guess, I'll ask another question that we can jump on Zoom, but
sure.
I want to understand how your writing process looks like. Like, do you outline things before you jump into writing each chapter? I mean, because, even on the Mastermind, we were talking and, you speak specifically about like, oh, I finished a chapter today. And I'm just thinking like, I guess it's kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of a thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? So I'm just curious about your specific writing process and what that looks like.
Absolutely. Well, I could describe that process by talking about this new book that I'm writing right now, which is called Daydream Believer. And this book is my effort to grapple with what I surmise are the ultimate powers of our minds, like the lines that you and I have been talking about. And on one hand, I eschew structure. I don't necessarily outline a book from beginning to end. In fact, I find that a lot of my assemblage of chapters is kind of impromptu. I'll write a chapter perhaps based on an experience. I might have some sort of experience where, let's say, something within me, a thought, a picture, an image, an emotionalized concept will concretize in the outer world. And I'll start to ask myself about these connections and what's there and what happened. And that might inspire me to write a chapter or a piece of a chapter. So I can't necessarily plan in advance exactly what I'm going to lay down where or where it's going to go. Or if I'm writing a more historical book like Occult America or my book One Simple Idea, which is a history and analysis of the positive mind movement, if I'm writing a historical book, I might do more to map out where I'm going to go. But even there's still a very impromptu quality because while I'm researching, I'll make certain connections. I'll pick up on certain things. I'll have certain associations that are unexpected. And boom, suddenly I'm off and running, writing a chapter about maybe a particular historical figure who I didn't think was going to figure into the book or I didn't think was going to be very important, but who might become kind of a major facet of the book unexpectedly because that's where my research led me. So I won't necessarily, whether I'm writing historically or whether I'm writing practically, I won't necessarily map out where I'm going to go. But I do have a general sense of how long I want the work to be, what kind of vessel I'm looking at, what I'm looking to fill. And I benefit, and this is a very personal, subjective practice, but I benefit from feeling like I do have some sense of the vessel physically. So, for example, I will create a cover sheet. I will create a table of contents. I might even go and paste my about the author at the back of the book. I will slug a page for the index. I will make sure that as I'm writing, each chapter follows the same format in terms of font or spacing or whatever, And stylistically, I like to feel that I have some sort of a vessel or a container that is filling up. It's very satisfying to me. So it's ironic because I won't map out where the book is going, but I do like to have a sense of the vessel. And so, for example, for Daydream Believer, I already have the cover to Daydream Believer, and I like the cover very much. So on the cover of my manuscript, I just basically pasted an image of the cover. So that's there. And every time I open it, I look at that and I realize this is the vessel that I'm filling. This is the vessel that I'm filling. My aim is to bring the book to a total of about 50,000 words. I'm currently at about 31,000 words. And so I'm very cognizant of that, and I'm looking at that and I'm like, okay, I've got chapters 1 through 8 drafted out. I realize that, chapter 1 needs a lot more work. Chapter 7 is in good shape. Chapter 8 is incomplete. I'm cognizant of where some of the gaps and the holes are. And I don't know what's going to be chapter 9 and 10. I might have ideas of where I think I'm going to go, but I might not get suitably fired up about the subjects that I intended to cover. And some other subject might come to me and I'll just pursue that other subject. So that becomes the chapter. But feeling the presence of a vessel is, for me personally, very important. And seeing that vessel fill up and get refined is very satisfying.
Yeah. And I would assume that part of the fun of creating the book is that sort of archaeological excavation to where you're essentially piecing together the puzzle as it's forming. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And you never know where it's going to go. I mean, when I was writing Occult America, I discovered at a certain point that a lot of what is current in alternative spirituality was born, was popularized, at least in the U.S., in a region of upstate New York called the Burned Over District, which is like this snaking stretch of land in upstate New York. And I kept coming back again and again to the Burned Over District, and it became such a mystery. Why that place? Why that locale? What was it there that it gave birth to spiritualism, gave birth to the suffragist movement. It gave birth to new religions like Mormonism and Seventh-day Adventism and much else besides. And what was it about this snaking stretch of farmland in central New York State that was so pivotal in the first half of the 1800s for everything that was new and that was novel in spirituality? And so I was aware of the Burned Over District. I mentioned the Burned Over District in my proposal, but it was only when I began writing the book and digging deeper and deeper and deeper, to use your archaeological reference, that I realized what a vast underground city that was, and how that became a much more important part of the book than I ever could have foreseen. So whatever it is you're doing, you never know where it's going to go. And there's always going to be surprises, and there should be surprises, because by all lights, as you're working, as you're researching, whatever it is that you're doing, if something in your assumptions doesn't get challenged, overturned, or some wholly new thing doesn't get introduced, there's probably something wrong. That's inevitably going to happen when you're working, because you just don't know how things are ultimately going to look, because you haven't discovered everything, where you're digging. And so I'm always discovering things. And there's always unexpected things that enter into whatever I'm working on.
I think that's also a good metaphor also to what you were talking about with the articles, and allowing those sort of micro decisions to create macro results, if you will, So, you essentially researching this place and then allowing that to inform you on how to write Occult America. I think it's very relatable in a lot of ways. And I'm curious, so how does that process work for you? Do you do research and writing simultaneously, or do you find that to be a distraction? And do you separate them?
No, I really do them simultaneously. I might be researching something, or I might stumble upon a topic that suddenly announces itself to me with unique relevance. I might read an article somewhere, and something in that article fosters a connection for me between disparate things that I've been thinking about. And I'll just drop everything and I'll start researching. And then at the same time, I might start writing, and I'll be, I'll flip back and forth between the writing and the research, because if you feel you've found a certain way of rendering something, you don't want to lose that. So you need to kind of dive into the writing portion of it, even if you're going to go back and revise it, which is a critical part of all works of writing. I mean, revising is writing. And so, but I'll want to get something down so I don't lose whatever rendering I may be able to bring to it. And then I'll flip back into the research, and I'll flip back and forth very feverishly. Mm-hmm. So it's always a mixture. Both are going on at once.
Do you find that you're most creative in the morning?
I do find the morning is a critical time. I always encourage people never squander the morning. If people get up and they start reading the newspaper or whatever, or spending time on social media, they're pissing away their most valuable hours of the day.
I agree. I totally
it's really
agree.
Supple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't waste the morning, whatever you do. Don't give that over to Twitter or whatever it may be. You know, that I've seen a lot of writers lose themselves that way, and the morning is absolutely critical.
Yeah. I found that to be the case as well, because I used to, like the past couple of weeks ago. So I used to do all my workouts directly when I wake up. And I found that there's something about, and maybe you can, give more information on this, but I found that when I wake up immediately and then I go and, make my coffee, start drinking coffee, and then start writing, that maybe it's because I just finished sleeping. I feel more in touch with my subconscious state of mind.
Yes.
Do you know much about that?
I think that's a good supposition, where our minds are rested, and ideally at least. And so some of the noise or the attachments or the distractions of the day haven't yet fully evinced their hold on us. We're waking up out of a dream state. We may be more gosh, it's hard to decide what words to use, but there may be something more essential going on, whereas as the day goes on, even within just like 90 minutes, I become much more reactive. I'm reacting to a piece of news, or I'm reacting to something on social media, or I'm reacting to something that, is going on in my household or whatever it is. But when you wake up, you're not in that reactive state. I got up really early this morning and I started in on a piece of writing, and it worked out very well because I made a connection among some things I was looking at that was very helpful, very useful. And I wanted to just get up and get it down, and so whether I was in touch with my subconscious or just some more essential line of thought, I can't quite say, but being, your mind does depend, whatever its ultimate nature, it depends upon the organ of the brain, and you got to be rested. There has to be some physical vitality going on and some lack of distraction. And the morning is the time for that.
Yeah. I'm no, neuroscientist or anything, but the brain is a muscle. So the more that you use that muscle throughout the day, like you only have a minimum supply of how much you can use that muscle. It's very similar to like working out. If you're going through strenuous activities such as, intaking tons and tons of images, like hundreds of images on social media, or, reading a lot of comments from people on Twitter. I mean, I think, that can take a lot of brain power, and that brain power and capacity, especially for creative people, that's vital. That is what you need to thrive off of. So to be able, I was thinking about this, and, maybe you can attest to this as well, but I was thinking about writing in terms of like, that's like my new religion almost. Do you think about that in terms of the sort of like a sacred ritual around your writing practice?
Well, I certainly see it as the result of something that I regard as sacred. If I regard desire as sacred, if I regard desire as a kind of driving engine behind the direction of my emotionalized thoughts, and there's truth to the thought causation thesis, which I believe there is, my being able to arrive at a place where writing is a critical part of my life is the result of what I suppose could be considered the sacred, in my existence. So it's the fruit of what I consider to be a facet of human life, that what we think about, what we're emotionally keyed up about, what ideals run through our mind do, I believe, outpicture in a way that goes beyond cognition and motor skills. And that's obviously a broader topic that we can come to terms with another time, but that is part of my outlook. I mean, that's that's a critical facet of my spiritual outlook. And by spiritual, I mean extra physical. And so my work as a writer, presenter, speaker is, as I see it, a result of that.
Well, Mitch, thanks for taking the time to do this. I appreciate you. I know that you're you're tired and you've been writing a lot. So
I don't sleep. So
yeah.
I'm really happy to be here. No, I really enjoyed the talk very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate it. Cool.
Absolutely.
Music for the podcast is by Reshaped, aka Justin Dosher Hopkins. Creative producer is Noah Wainwright. YouTube and creative support is by Tyler Scully. Thanks so much for tuning in. See you next time.